observing. Oops. We also know that many projects integrate modeling into planning their observational activities in sort of more formal or ad hoc, informal or ad hoc ways, not just in these observation system simulation experiments. So today we have two speakers that are going to talk about different projects that they're involved in that have used modeling to inform observational activities. And these are speakers from two different disciplines, which is part of the reason we have such a big group today. So we're really hoping that these two different presentations will help spark discussion about other examples and ideas of bringing modeling and observations together. So before we get to our two presenters, since this is the observing team meeting, we're going to have a brief update from Sandy Starkweather about US Arctic Observing Network, or US AON board activities. And then we'll go into our presentations. And we're going to ask people to hold their questions on the presentations until the end of the meeting, where we'll have time for discussion. Okay, go ahead, Sandy.
Okay, thanks, Sally. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. I'm also serving as a co-lead on the observing team in addition to my role with USAON. And I'm sitting in for Roberto Delgado from the National Science Foundation, who is the chair of the federal USAON board. And he usually provides an update on the board discussions in this venue, but he wasn't available today. So the board did take a little bit of a recess over the summer, but that also included meeting with, as the National Committee to Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks, our international counterpart to the National Arctic Observing Network activities. And so that served as our July meeting, and then we took an August recess. And when we reconvened last week, we were able to put the final touches on our terms of reference for approval by the IARPC staff group. And I believe those are going to be publicly available once completed. So we'll be sure to update you in this meeting comment section if you're curious to take a look at those. We also had a small change to our board. Michelle McClure, who had been serving as the lead from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, is stepping down to assume the role as the head of delegation for the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, or AMAP. And so she's going to be replaced in her role on the USAON board by David Allen, who is the program manager for NOAA's Arctic Research Program. So probably the heart of what the board's been talking about for the last couple of months, and that we'll continue to talk about, is how we can identify a meaningful deliverable from the context of USAON, which really focuses on that research policy and planning interface with the science and technology of observations, to better inform the kinds of investments that the agencies are making, but also to support the community in their own coordination with each other to better focus research-based observing and sustained observing programs. And so in that context, one of the deliverables that we're looking at is doing a very broad observing system assessment following our methodology known as value tree analysis, and focusing that assessment potentially on one of the priority areas within the plan. But the scoping of that specific deliverable is going to be a subject of debate for some board meetings moving into the future. What is exciting is that in the next plan, I think most people are aware, is that the modeling and observing teams are going to be working much more closely together. And so this meeting series that we're doing here, I think, is strongly suggestive of the direction that we'll be trying to take these discussions in the future to better understand the sort of complex of ways in which models and observing systems need to improve their coordination with one another to support the outcomes that we're looking for. And then the last piece is to say that we spent a little time updating our communication strategy. And we're actively working on a website, and we'll have more information on that for you. Also through the observing team, we'll be sure to let everybody know about that. So I'm happy to field any questions. And we can also just always, if you follow up with an email, send you any of the resources I described in an email as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandy. Any questions for Sandy? Okay, we'll move to our first speaker, who is Coleen Iversen from Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And Colleen's going to speak on an iterative and integrative cycle, how models guide observations in the NGEE Arctic project. As I said, we'll save the discussion for after the two presentations, but you can put comments in the chat while you're waiting, and then we'll do them afterwards. So go ahead, Coleen.
Okay, great. Can I get a thumbs up from someone that you can see my, okay, great. Hi, everybody. I am Coleen Iversen, and I am presenting on behalf of the NGEE Arctic project today. In particular, I'm the Deputy Director of NGEE Arctic, and I'm presenting on behalf of Peter Thornton, who is our Chief Modeler, and Stan Wilschlager, who is the PI of the project. And if you want to find out more about me and the kind of science I do, you can check out my website or follow me on Twitter. And the two I words there weren't meant to be a tongue twister, but those are sort of the two words that I think about when I think about how modelers and empiricists like me work together. And so just to mention, we're very grateful that NGEE Arctic is supported by the Biological and Environmental Research Program and the Department of Energy's Office of Science. And it spans 4 national laboratories: Oak Ridge National Lab, Brookhaven National Lab, Los Alamos National Lab, and Berkeley Lab, as well as the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Let's see. And here is what we all looked like in the before time. So it's 140 of us across the project. And this is in 2019 when we were together for our annual all hands meeting. And so we have an overarching goal for the NGEE Arctic project, which maybe is a little different than some of the other sort of science projects out there, which our goal is to deliver a model. So a process-rich ecosystem model that can sort of predict and project the entirety of the living biosphere from bedrock to the top of the vegetative canopy across the Arctic at the scale of a high-resolution Earth system model grid cell. And that can be 1 degree or sort of 1/4 degree now as we're moving it to smaller spatial scales. And so thinking about the model as the overarching focus of the science that we do, I think can be kind of summed up in a diagram like this that Paul Hansen and Anthony Walker put out in 2019. So on the left, the sort of 2 circles there, the top circle is what empiricists like me would normally do. So you have a question, you come up with some predictions, you do an experiment, you look at the response, and you accept or reject your hypothesis. And sometimes maybe after you publish a paper, a modeler will take those data and maybe use it in a model to do some model experiments. But really what we would like to do within this project is more what's on the right. So we're sort of short-circuiting or integrating the 2 sort of empirical and modeling circles. Models help us to determine which questions are most relevant, where the holes are, where the uncertainties are in the models. And at the same time as we, from those questions, are developing testable predictions and doing experiments on the empirical side, the models are doing development. So it's models have this uncertainty. What concepts should we test empiricists? What is missing from the model? Sort of working together and then coming back together and closing that loop at the end and thinking about what models are missing in terms of discovery science, and also sort of what models can tell us that we need to go out and measure next. So the measurements, the observations that we do are located mostly in Alaska, and so in the North Slope of Alaska, as well as outside of Nome on the Seward Peninsula a little further south. And so here's some sort of photos of the NGEE team, plus the mosquitoes that are a beloved part of the team, working both on the North Slope and places where the shrubs are only this tall, and further south on the Seward Peninsula where the shrubs are actually taller than me, and you have the mountain vistas. And so the questions that we ask across the NGEE Arctic project are very wide ranging. So they span from permafrost thaw to shrub expansion to the distribution of water across these evolving tundra landscapes. And of course, quantifying the underlying hydrobiogeochemical processes as well. And we've adapted this picture from a drawing that Victor Leshik made for Ted and Michelle in 2018 to just sort of say, we're measuring processes from hydrology to topography to permafrost to biogeochemistry, and thinking about the Arctic as a holistic system, both in observations and in the models. And so the model that we are specifically interested in informing is the E3SM land model, which is the Department of Energy's Earth system model, E3SM, the land model component of that. So there's a land, an atmosphere, and an ocean, and the model, just like in the real world, and we focus on the land component. And the way that ELM captures the heterogeneity of the Arctic or any other ecosystem is with this hierarchical units, right? So we said we wanted to model the Pan-Arctic at the resolution of a high resolution grid cell in the model. And then in the model, we can divide the Arctic into topographic units. So that could be something like polygonal tundra or a drained thaw lake basin, or even a plant community. The vegetation that's on that topographic unit, and then the soil that underlies that vegetation. And currently in the current version 2 ELM land model, the way that all of the plant species across the Arctic are represented are in 3 plant functional types. That's the PFT. So there is an Arctic grass, an evergreen shrub, and a deciduous shrub. So of course, plant ecologists like me see a lot of opportunities to interface with the modeling community there. And sort of the diagram on the right is to show you, in addition to these sort of, boring kind of squares, we really are, and the models are via algorithms simulating what happens in the virtual world of the tundra. So plant communities on soil and all the nitrogen and phosphorus, carbon and water cycling that happens in those systems. We also, a 1 degree grid cell or even a 1/4 degree grid cell might seem huge to those of you who are empiricists. And that's true for us too. So we use multi-scale modeling within the project to think about getting to the entirety of the land surface of the Arctic by using models that sort of simulate smaller scales, so that to help empiricists like me ask and answer questions in a meaningful way. And one way to show you that is to show you sort of different scales at which we're using models within the project. And so all the way to the left is the ATS Arctic Terrestrial Simulator, which is simulating ponding in some polygons on the North Slope, really highly explicitly in 3 dimensions over a few days. And then the second is ATS, but sort of with the horizontal connections sort of aggregated a bit to help us get to things like ELM. So the third is the thinking about watersheds and the physical data like elevation and aspect that we can use to say, okay, a grid cell has these characteristics. And then at the fourth to the right there is sort of the day met temperature data at a daily scale that we can use to parameterize ELM, which is the final there, looking at leaf area index across the entirety of the Arctic. So there's lots of questions that we ask and answer across these different models and these different scales, but our ultimate goal really is the entirety of the Arctic land surface. So the project's been ongoing since 2011, 2012. And so over this last decade or so, we've been integrating and iterating with models and observations and synthesis. We had a couple of MODEX, which is the sort of phrase that our DOE program managers have coined for model experiment integration, lessons that we wanted to share. The first is a fun one. So we bring modelers to the field with us. And while we're in the field, the modelers can sort of see what the empiricists are dealing with, the heterogeneity on the ground, and also help us to understand what key model needs might be. Sometimes empiricists like me get stuck on the super interesting science question and don't necessarily think about the boring model drivers or total carbon content that the model might need as validation or driver data. And so that conversation that happens when we're all in the field together can be a really important one. And modelers asked me why they had asterisks floating over their head, and I told them not to worry about it. It was just for demonstration purposes. But you can see that we do enjoy working together in the field. And I wanted to show you Peter Thornton there, and there's sort of the bottom picture. He doesn't just come with us, he actually helps us to collect observations. And the second, I think, is sort of the important framework that we instituted. So we added an integrated modeling framework. And so it cuts across the science questions that we have in ways that can pull together a bunch of different empirical observations into a unit of the model. So code improvement that we can then deliver to our sponsor. And not only did we do these integrated modeling crosscuts, but we had key project champions. So someone is in charge of thinking about how we integrate across a number of different questions across the project. And so I have vegetation highlighted in red because I'm going to give you a few examples from that. But we have crosscuts on sort of snowpack and inundation. I showed you some of the ATS model results, soil nutrients, temperature and water, topography and terrain. And so just to show you what this kind of looks like within the vegetation integrated modeling framework, we've done a couple of things here. So one, we've done some synthesis. So Alistair Rogers and I have both synthesized data on how the left is VC max photosynthesis, how the VC max of tundra plant species differs in comparison to this dashed line, which is what models are currently predicting that it should be in the Arctic tundra. And then on the right, I've done some synthesis work showing the below ground to above ground allocation investment of tundra plant species. And again, how it differs from that dashed line of what terrestrial biosphere models are currently predicting. So these are ways which existing data can help us to better inform the model structure. And then we also make new observations. So Verity salmon, the current version of ELM does not have a nitrogen fixing plant functional type, and we knew that was a need for some portions of the Arctic. And so Verity went out and measured nitrogen fixation rates, but also how they scale across the landscape and how the distribution of an alder that associates with the nitrogen fixing bacteria has changed across this hill slope over time and might be contributing more nitrogen to the system. And then Benjamin Salmon this year has taken those data, those photosynthesis data, the allocation data, the nitrogen fixation data, and looked at one point. So the cool thing about ELM is you can run it across the entirety of the Pan-Arctic, or you can run it at a single site. And so he ran this land surface model at a point called a point version at our site, incorporating these new data and adding plant functional types that we know to be important in the tundra. So instead of just having a graminoid and 2 shrubs, we have all these different plant functional types that are parameterized for the communities that we know exist there. And so this was a modeling collaboration between Ben, a modeler with ELM, and all of us who had been collecting and synthesizing data from the project. So now we have these new plant functional types in the model that can better predict carbon storage for the future of the Arctic, but we only have it for one place, one point, right? And so we need to be able to extend that inference more broadly. And so that's when this sort of scaling component comes in, and where we collaborate with friends like our NASA Above folks to think about, okay, where are these plant functional types, not just at our one hill slope, but across the tundra in places where we're working on the Seward Peninsula, or even more broadly. And Zach Langford and G2 Kumar and others have used machine learning to help us sort of train data, or train this algorithm on sites where we actually have data, and to extrapolate across the Arctic, or at least across the region. So then we can tell models what the fractional cover of these plant communities are, so they can get the biogeochemical cycling right. So that was one example of the vegetation component of our integrated modeling framework. A third lesson was early on in the project, we implemented these open and fair data sharing policies, which have really driven collaboration. And so you can actually go to our NGEE Arctic data portal and see the 124 public data sets that we've collected as a project. And we even have another 60 that are internal that the modelers can access right away. So it's a place where we're both sharing data with a broader community, but sharing it within the project as well. So once empiricists plan to collect data, the modelers can see what's there and reach out for collaboration as well. And then the fourth lesson, I think, is really project-wide and not just in this data model integration. It's developing a culture of safety and trust and team science. So we're quite a big team, almost 150 people, and we want to make sure that we are psychologically and physically safe when we go to the remote tundra locations, but also when we have annual meetings or when we collaborate within smaller teams. And so we wrote an article last year on how we've worked really intentionally to develop this culture of trust where folks feel like they can trust each other enough to share data and to collaborate in a really useful way. And so just wanted to end by saying each MODEX collaboration that we have within the project, I think, brings us one step closer to improving how the model projects processes that are occurring across the tundra. And really, once we feel like we can get that right now, will give us more confidence in our ability to predict what the future might hold for tundra ecosystems and the folks that live there. And so I wanted to just close by saying you could visit our website and check out more about what we're doing. And just to say thanks again to our funders at BER and also to ARM for their assistance getting us started on the North Slope. So thank you for that, Sally. And also wanted to make sure we thank the Native corporations for allowing us to conduct our research on the traditional homelands of the Inupiat people, UIC Science on the North Slope, and also Mary's Igloo, Council, and Sitnasuk Native corporations outside of Nome. So thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Coleen. That was very interesting. So as I said, we'll hold discussion until after the next talk, but if you have a question that you don't want to forget, you can go ahead and put it in the chat. Now we'll move on to our second speaker, who is Mathieu Morlighem from Dartmouth University. And he's going to speak on using mass conservation to inform ice penetrating radar campaigns.
Thank you, Sally. Let me share my screen. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Good. All right, well, hello, and thank you so much for having me. I want to talk about how we use mass conservation to inform these campaigns these radar campaigns as part of Operation Icebridge. So the goal was really to provide inputs to the science team and to whoever was doing the mission planning so that new measurements collected by Operation Icebridge would reduce the uncertainty in bed mapping most efficiently. So I thought that most people would be familiar with Operation Icebridge, but I guess I have to tell you guys a bit more about it now. So it's the largest airborne survey of the ice sheets ever flown. And it's basically a mission that was bridging the gap between ICESat-1 that stopped working in 2009 and ICESat-2 that has been in space for 2 years, I believe now. So because there was a data gap, NASA decided to have this airborne mission to measure surface altimetry of the ice sheets so that there wouldn't be any gap. So it was great because they were flying over the ice sheet and they could have more instruments than just an altimeter. So they had a radar to measure the depth of the ice. They had a snow radar to measure the accumulation in the surface. They had a gravimeter. They had lots of different instruments. And so one question that came frequently was, where should we collect ice thickness data to reduce the uncertainty in sea level projections? And they always had a modeler or two in their science team to help with that. I have never been in the science team, unfortunately, but I was invited into science team meetings and I provide lots of inputs, as I'm going to show you in a minute. Okay, so one thing that I'm going to talk about now is the bed topography under the ice, because it's a huge, it's still a big uncertainty, and models cannot work properly if we don't have a good description of the bed topography. Just like bathymetry is key to ocean models, the landscape under the ice really determines how the ice goes to the ocean, where it's stable, where it's unstable. So we need to have the best possible description of that bed topography. So the bed topography or the ice thickness, because we know the surface really well, so I may use ice thickness of bed topography interchangeably, is most efficiently measured by airborne ice penetrating radars. So you have here the NASA P3 airplane that was used as part of Operation Icebridge. So it had lots of instruments. The one that I'm looking at here is this one under the wings, the McCords, which is, I believe, a system from University of Kansas. And basically what it gives us is an X-ray right under the aircraft. So we can see here the air, the ice, measure the ice thickness and get the bed topography where it's grounded or the base of the ice where it's floating. And it's very, very efficient. It's a wonderful method. The only problem is we don't get any measurement outside of the flat line. So you get the bed topography measurement very accurate under the aircraft, but nothing on the sides. And modelers, of course, need a full three-dimensional description of the bed topography. So we need to find a way to fill the gaps between the different flight lines that we have. To give you an idea, this looks like a campaign of Operation Icebridge. So all the lines that you see are flight lines where the radar is mounted under the wings and we get some measurement of the bed topography. It looks like it's very dense, but if you look in the detail, some of these flight lines, I mean, even the ones that look very close to each other are probably 10 kilometers apart. So we still have, a lot of uncertainty in between these lines. So I'm not going to go too much into the details. I didn't know what this crowd would be like, but basically, I'm an ice sheet modeler by training, and still today, I'm trying to use models to improve predictions of sea level rise. And as I was doing my PhD, we quickly realized that the bed topography was a critical input for ice sheet models that I just told you. And what we had at the time was simply not good enough to provide any realistic projections. We were not going to do anything unless the description of the bed was getting better. And so we came up with this idea that in models, we use mass conservation to determine how the ice thins or thickens. If you have a zone of convergence of ice, remember that ice is, is a viscous material. If you have a zone of convergence, it may thicken. A zone of divergence, it may thin. And so that's basically what this mass conservation law describes. But instead of calculating the thinning rate or thickening rate, we turned this equation around and said, let's figure out what the ice thickness should be so that the model thinning rate or thickening rate matches observations. And at the same time, we also want that ice thickness to be as close as possible, which is what this term is, to observations where we have them. So we want to minimize the misfit between the modeled ice thickness that's consistent with the conservation of mass and the measured ice thickness from radar data. So that's a little bit the idea of what the algorithm is doing. You have, we take at the inflow boundary, we have a constrained ice thickness, and then we move it forward using observed surface velocity. So we know where the ice is going, we know where it's converging, diverging, and we can map the entire domain with this. And so with that method, we released a new data set called Bed Machine. And basically this method works really, really well in regions where we have fast flow, in regions where we have slower flow. It's not that great. There is a lot of uncertainty, but overall, we were able to release these two products to the community, and they're called Bed Machine because we keep updating them as we get more radar data, and we can rerun these models and improve the bed topography mapping. Okay, so to do that and how this interfaced with OIB, Operation Icebridge, the first thing was to try to collect all available radar data available to the community. So for Greenland, it was fairly easy because most of it was from Operation Icebridge. And even early on, after a couple of years, we already had a lot more data than what was collected before. For Antarctica, it was a lot more complicated because it had been collected by various agencies in different formats in different countries. But we could put everything together and try to run that conservation of mass algorithm to try to map the bed. Once we have that, we can then look at where we have data gaps. So where collecting data may improve the mapping of the bed. So here you have a few examples. So this is in Antarctica. This is Ronnie Ice Shelf, Frost Ice Shelf, and what you're seeing here is the flow speed. We don't need to worry too much about it. And the lines are lines where we have data from other missions. And we could identify fairly easily where the flow was fast enough for mass conservation to work and where additional flight lines may considerably increase the accuracy of the mapping. So this is another example. This is a Brunt ice shelf with Stencomb whales feeding it, Slesser ice stream. So we could have a vague idea of where measurements could be made. But now we could do something even better, which is that Bed Machine comes with an air map. And so I guess the panel that's more that you should focus on is this one, panel G, where you have the flight lines in white, where we have data, and in between is the uncertainty in the mapping method based on mass conservation. You see that obviously it increases in between flight lines. As you get further away from a region where you know the bed, the uncertainty increases. So using this map, we see that getting more lines closer to, so this is the terminus of the glacier over here would be, I mean, more measurements is always great, but getting more measurements further inland would be more beneficial to reduce that uncertainty. So we could use these error maps to try to guide where flight lines would be most beneficial. And what we did then is to propose actual flight lines to the science team. So I would basically go on Google Earth, upload all the existing lines, and draw the lines that made the most sense. And I didn't make this point very clear, but for this method to work well, method of conservation of mass, it's best to have flight lines that are across flow, because in one single line, you're constraining the entire flux of a given system. If in the past, people used a lot of long flow flight lines, and it's great, but you'd only constrain the flux of that single line instead of the whole domain if you go across. So I basically provided some ideas of flight lines to the science team, and then they sometimes, in some cases, they could accommodate them, sometimes not. But that's how we had this conversation going, mission after mission. Something I should have mentioned is OIB went on for, I don't know, maybe more than 10 years. So every year there would be a mission in Greenland and a mission in Antarctica, and we could iterate like this over time. So OIB would collect data. CRISIS, which is a I forget what the acronym is for, but it's a center at University of Kansas, would process the data and give us echograms and bed pics. So they could tell us, we think this is the bed along the X-ray, and then I would run the mass conservation approach. And in some cases, they just would not match. And it's in a very few cases that we could actually go back to the echogram and say, hey, I don't think the bed pic that you think is the bed is real. And in this case, we could actually not see the bed because it was so deep, this is Jakobshavn Isbrae, that this bed pic was just wrong. So we could correct the processing itself. So it in a way was a very cool project because we could identify where measurements should be made, correct measurements in some places where they were wrong, and at the end of the day, provide a new data set to the modeling community. And so bed machine, after a few months, after a campaign, once the radar data were available, we would remap the entire ice sheet and release this at NSIDC, the National Center for Snow and Ice Data Center, I think it's called. And so, because something to keep in mind is that ice sheet modelers do not use radar data. It's just, in one single line. So they need to have this 3D map. And in a way, bed machine was the ideal intermediary step between the data being collected and modelers that need a better bed to make new projections. Okay, so to conclude about the lessons learned in that process. So I have to say I've been very lucky with Operation Icebridge. It has been a very inclusive team. Modelers were solicited regularly and invited to science team meetings, to workshops, etc. So I was not affiliated with OIB at all. I was not in the science team, but they were very much open to inputs so that they could have the best science return. So in many cases, missions are designed to support predictive models, but maybe this is just my take on it. I think once the mission is going, this link is kind of lost. So I think it's good to keep modelers in science teams to make that link between the data being collected and the improvements in models. What made this collaboration with OIB so successful, I think, was that we identified regions that would benefit the most from additional data. We proposed flight lines. We provided feedback on data processing, where there were bad bed pics, and we constructed a data set useful to the community. So we had really a full loop between the data collection and modelers. That was really, really helpful. Modelers need to quantify uncertainty carefully because in many cases, data are being collected to reduce the uncertainty in models. And while quantifying uncertainty is horribly difficult, but I think it's necessary in order to best guide missions because they're doing this for us at the end of the day. So quantifying uncertainty is something we should all pay attention to. So I think it's the one before last is being flexible. In terms of mission planning, OIB was really open to fly almost anywhere. Of course, there are constraints. You can be that far from the airport or you can't fly for that long. But overall, they were open to fly in many different regions. And they were also open to emerging modeling approaches. So this approach of mass conservation was developed after OIB was launched. And so they were open to try something else, something new. And I think that was very valuable. The last thing I would mention is the risk of driving a mission with one single model, which was the case of in the case of OIB for that specific project. There was no other approach available, so that's just what how it was. But if we had to do this again, I think we should really try to have a group of modelers rather than just one, because of course the mean of model outputs is a lot more accurate than one single output. Okay, I think this is it. I'll be happy to take questions, and you have my email here in case you have questions.
Great, thank you, Matthew. Those were both very different yet very interesting talks. So first question I have to ask Matthew is, did you get out into the field?
I wish I could have been on that airplane, but no. I think if
Maybe
I have
time,
pushed it, maybe I could have. Yeah. But next time I'm on that airplane.
Okay, Richard.
So Sally took my exact question, but just to expand and going back to Coleen's talk as well, there's been a lot of efforts to put modelers into the field. And so in Matthew, in your conclusions, it seemed like you're alluding to the fact that if there was a modeler in the field, they could be a voice in planning the next day's flight plan and things like that, and that would be an important thing. But beyond that, do you think there are any other reasons for putting modelers into the field for improving the models and things like that?
Oh, that's a tough question. I think I've personally never been in the field, which I find very sad. And I'm sure that would change my perspective on, what I'm doing every day. So I would love to go in the field. If anybody is looking for people, you know where to find me. In terms of, next day, sort of where should data be collected, I think it would have been difficult in this case because it takes a long time for the radar data to be processed, the bed to be picked, and then run a new version of bed machine. There's ways to, jump steps and just assume it's there and rerun an error map. So it could have been done, but it would have been difficult. Let's put it this way. But again, not impossible. So yeah, I think just also realizing how difficult it is to go in the field. I think a lot of modelers, including me, potentially think that the data is it's on the server. It's easy to get when it takes many sleepless nights, lots of sweat to get these data. So we should make sure we are aware of this aspect too.
I was going to say that as well. But also I would say it's nice for them to bring their perspective. And so they just have this experience with the algorithms and knowing what's connected to what that I think they can bring when they come to the field. That's not just seeing how hard it is to dig a big hole and then fill it up again, but sort of like, I know that I'm going to need these driver data, or like that hill slope over there looks totally different and I would represent it differently in the model, that perspective. And so what we've been pushing our modelers for actually is reciprocity. So we would like them to set up some Docker sites where we can actually run these land surface models and ask questions ourselves and, push buttons and kind of see what happens, because we don't have that like bring an empiricist to the model kind of part yet. And so we've been thinking about that too.
Yeah, that's really interesting to flip it around a little bit. I guess one question sort of for both of you is, do you sometimes when different communities are talking to each other, you can have translational problems. So I guess I wonder if you've experienced that and any lessons learned there.
I can go first if you want, Coleen.
Yeah.
Yes, I have experienced that. So I think, so in that context, what was happening is it was part of the International Thwaites Glacier collaboration project, which is a big NSF project. And there is observationalists, there are modelers, and the question was, what is it that modelers need the most to improve models? And I was actually part of the committee in charge, so I would ask all the modelers, and we all came with, number one, better bed. You would ask people making observations and doing field work, and each of them would have a different response because they think, and I hate to say this, but they think that what they do is what's most important. But sometimes it's, it's important, but it may not be number one. It may be number two, maybe number 10. So it's not like these measurements should not be collected, but it's if we had to name one priority, bed would be one. So it got a bit bad in that meeting room when we looked at the results and we said modelers really want a better bed, knowing the viscosity of the ice or the friction coefficient of the bed or something else is great, but it's not what we are after first.
So from our perspective, we have a sort of take a modeler to lunch philosophy within our teams. And so Ornell recently put together 3 different divisions in a climate change science institute so that we're all in the before times co-located together, have the opportunity to chat in the hallway, have lunch together. And I think I've learned so much over the last 11 years about how the models work and what the philosophy is and what they need. So just because models have to necessarily simplify the world and things like the better, the most important, doesn't mean that the discovery science that we do isn't important. We just have to think of it in that broader context, right? And so that's why I think it's really important to have it's a relationship, these teams and this collaboration. And so that's where we've been thinking about it as.
Great. And then I saw there was a question in the chat from Pat Taylor. Pat, did you want to ask that or follow up on that?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Ali. Yeah. So I was just curious, Coleen. I was intrigued by the you're mentioning about developing the intentional culture, and I was curious about the specific activities you guys did as a team in order to help develop that culture of collaboration and psychological safety.
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's something we've been thinking about a lot, and I think the intentional part of it was the really important part. And so I don't want to be like, oh, check out this article, but we do list it all out there. But some of the things I talked about today are in there too. So this, open sharing of data, but also things like we just recently did some tabletop exercises where we got together and thought about a series of what if scenarios that could happen in the Arctic and sort of talked about them together in breakout rooms. We have annual all hands meetings where we talk about science, but we also celebrate scientists. So awards for sort of the best data set or the best model interaction and that kind of thing. And we also did a lot of listening. And so it's been an evolution over the last 10 years of making sure that the leadership team is listening to scientists on the ground about how we need to have a code of conduct. We need to have multiple people that we can call if there's an issue, and sort of that iteration and developing that trust across the project members. So it's there are a few tangible things, but really it's about talking about it. So I think culture is set from the top. So every time we have a leadership meeting or an annual all hands meeting, we talk about safety, and not just physical safety, but psychological safety. And we think of the team as people and not just the science that they produce, if that helps answer your question.
That does. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Coleen. And Sandy, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks to both the speakers. I picked up on a lot of really interesting contrasts between your talks as well. And I think something that came up when we were looking at observing system experiments was, I think many of us were sort of stunned by how kind of computationally intensive some of the, we might see there's opportunities to use models to guide observations, but in some cases they're so computationally intensive that it's just not even really practical. And I think we heard some really different examples here today where there is, like in the case of the bed machine model, it seemed like, these are not long runs. You can figure things out in pretty short order. And then Coleen, I think I heard you say that there's maybe even a potential for the observational community to get in and do these small pixel-sized runs. And so, I think just an observation of that contrast, but from the standpoint of research planning, what kind of mechanisms were available in your research planning, be they really formal mechanisms or informal mechanisms that supported the kinds of relationship building and insights that you guys were able to achieve in your work?
Go ahead, Matthew. You want to go first?
Okay. So in my case, it was fairly informal, but there would be, I think there was like a call on a mailing list, the cryo list, a few months before a science team meeting. And the science team was basically requesting inputs from the modeling community. So we had a few months to put something together and propose something at the science team meeting that was always open. And I think the community realized year after year that this was, genuinely something they wanted to do, and they really wanted inputs from modelers. It was not just, oh, we want to involve you, but we already know what we want to do. So they made it clear that it was a two-way street, and I really liked it.
Ours is both super formal and also really informal. And so, as I mentioned at the outset, we are meant to deliver a model at the end of our project. But there's a lot of leeway within that, right? And so, improving tundra models of the Pan-Arctic or of the tundra, there's a lot of different questions you can ask. And so, as Matthew was saying, empiricists like me have a voice in sort of saying, I think these are the interesting science questions. And then the modelers who were embedded within each of the science questions within our project. So we don't have like a modeling team and like an empirical team. We have science questions that have both empiricists and modelers in them. The modelers would be like, I mean, that's cool, but are you going to give me the driving data and all of the sort of the validation data that I need? And also, the model has these 3 plant functional types. And so I'm happy for you to tell me how to aggregate all the plants into them, but given computational costs, we can't add 50 different tundra plant species kind of thing. And so it really is a conversation that's set up within this formal framework where MODEX is expected.
Thank you. Lauren?
Hi, yeah, I wanted to expand on some of that collaboration of, I'm wondering if you've been able to reach out to any of the indigenous groups and those communities with model outputs and get their feedback on what they're interested in and what's useful and what might be missing in some of the models.
Well, my answer is going to be sadly no, we did not. I think at the time, people were not so, I guess something we all need to do better. And at the time it was not under our radar, if I may. So that did not happen. With OMG, they're getting better. Sorry, I'm using ice jargon. It's Oceans Melting Greenland, which is another NASA mission. Now they go to schools in Greenland and show what they're doing. There is, so at least people in Greenland are aware of what they're collecting and what it is for. There is not necessarily the second mechanism you were mentioning, but I think in future missions that may happen.
And we've provided annual reports to the Native communities who we have given us permission to work on their land. And we've also done some outreach in the community where we've brought students with us to the field. And also on the North Slope, we had a bark barbecue. So the science labs up there are called the Bark. And so that was more of a the UIC Science Native community organized an outreach event in the before times, which was really fun, which we participated in. But we would love to do more of it. And I think it's a question of also of sort of priorities of the funding agencies, right? So if they wanted to give us the green light to make outreach an important component of what we do, we would be happy to add that to our model feedback loop.
Thank you.
Sally,
Any
can
other
I follow
questions?
up on
Will,
that?
yes,
Yeah.
please.
So to follow up on that a little bit, so the outreach is great, and I would hope that all the organizations would do that and have it just built in as an assumption. But I'm curious as to whether there are any efforts to actually use traditional knowledge into the models. In other words, as an addition to, supplement to, complement to the Western science, not just you telling them what you learned, but listen to them about what they know, often better than we do.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was on one of the panels at the Arctic Futures Conference a couple of years ago in DC, which brought together sort of Western scientists and indigenous communities and talked about indigenous knowledge as standing next to or being better than in these systems, sort of the Western science. And it's fascinating and intriguing and useful to think about how their knowledge from time immemorial could inform model structure or parameterization or provide a validation or a benchmark tool for these models. And that's something that we talked about there, but that we have not followed up on. But it's a great point.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? We have a couple minutes left in our hour. Or are there any updates from team members? We had a few minutes at the end. If anyone had announcements to make. Any advertisements for upcoming collaboration team meetings?
Yeah, hi Sally, this is Caitlin. On behalf of the Glaciers and Sea Level team, on October 14th, we're going to be having a kind of a mixed bag of updates from different NASA missions. So ISAT-2 and Grace Follow On, the project science offices from both of those missions are going to be briefing both the Glaciers and Sea Level change teams and the Sea Ice collaboration team. So if you're interested in hearing more about those missions, look out for announcements about those. It'll be coming out soon, I imagine.
Great, thank you, Caitlin. And Richard?
The modeling subteam September meeting is canceled. We are scheduled to have a meeting of program managers and their perspectives on modeling. We're hoping to have that meeting for October.
Great, thank you. And I don't think we had a terrestrial team member. Hazel, do we have an update on the next observing team meeting?
Yeah, the next observing team call is going to be focused on emerging technology. It should be really interesting. And we're looking at October 26th for that call, though the date may change a little bit. So keep an eye on the website. Yep.
Great, thank you. Okay, any last questions for our presenters?
I'd like to thank both presenters. Those are both really interesting, as Sally said, different presentations. I could see doing this again. That was actually, I hate to dish on all our previous meetings, but that was actually really good presentations and good questions. Thanks a lot to everyone.
Yes, thank you very much. I think those were very interesting perspectives, and I think it's really interesting to think about just having more and more of these conversations, I think, as both of you said, just to bring the different communities together and talk about things and start to gain kind of a common language. So, all right. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you so much for everyone who joined the meeting today.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.